Not silence exactly. Silence feels like absence, like something removed. What I mean is quiet. The kind that settles into a room after the last notification fades, after the door closes, and the deadbolt clicks, after the outside world finishes asking things of you for another day. That quiet is where I have always lived most honestly, and it took me decades to understand why. I want to tell you something true. Not the version of a story that gets cleaned up for other people's comfort, not the edited draft that leaves out the embarrassing middle sections. I want to give you the real thing. The slow, unremarkable, profoundly human process of figuring out who you are when the pressure of being someone else finally becomes too heavy to carry. My name, for the purposes of what I carry inside, has always felt slightly off. Not wrong in any dramatic, cinematic sense. No sudden revelation. No thunderclap of understanding. Just slightly off. Like a shirt that fits well enough that you wear it every day but pulls a little at the shoulders in a way you've learned not to mention. I grew up in an ordinary family in an ordinary neighborhood, surrounded by ordinary expectations. I want to be careful not to paint my childhood as dark or wounded because it wasn't, not really. My parents were decent people. My siblings were loud and familiar. There were holidays and arguments and forgettable Tuesday afternoons that blurred into one another. What there was not, and I only recognize this looking back now from the comfortable distance of many years, was space. Not physical space. Interior space. Room to ask certain questions out loud. The questions I had were not dramatic. They were more like persistent, low-frequency hums underneath everything else. Why did I feel something so unexpectedly calm when I passed certain sections of certain stores? Why did the aesthetics of softness, texture, color, the particular drape of certain fabrics, register in me as something almost like relief? Why, when I imagined versions of myself doing ordinary things, did the most comfortable version sometimes look different from the one in the mirror? I did not have language for any of this as a child. Most children don't. What I had instead was instinct, which led me towards certain things privately and away from others publicly, which is its own kind of wisdom even when it doesn't feel like one. The first memory I can locate with any real precision is from when I was around 10 or 11. My mother had left a silk scarf on the back of a chair in her bedroom, deep burgundy, printed with small geometric shapes, soft in a way that still registers in my fingertips if I think about it long enough. I picked it up to move it, the way children move things without thinking, and then I didn't put it down immediately. I held it for a moment longer than made practical sense. I draped it loosely around my shoulders, just to feel the weight of it, the way the color fell. And there it was. That quiet. Not excitement, not guilt, not confusion. Those would come later, in other forms. Just a sudden drop in internal pressure, the way you feel when you step out of a noisy building into an open street. For a few seconds, something in me stopped bracing. I put the scarf back before anyone saw. I went back to being 11. I didn't think about it consciously for years, but the body remembers what the mind files away. And over the following decade, in small, incremental, entirely unspectacular ways, I kept returning to that feeling without always knowing that was what I was doing. A magazine left out at a friend's house, stopped on for longer than curiosity alone could explain. A film where the costuming made something in me lean forward slightly. Small things. Peripheral things. A quiet accumulation that I treated consistently as something other than what it was. By the time I was in my early 20s, I had built a life that looked appropriately assembled from the outside. Work. Responsibilities. The social architecture of an adult existence. And underneath all of it, that persistent low hum, the sense that something in the way I moved through the world did not quite line up with something in the way I was. I want to be honest about something. This did not feel like suffering in any acute sense. I was not miserable. I functioned. I laughed. I made connections. What it felt like, more precisely, was expensive, the way maintaining a very specific presentation at all times is expensive, not in money, but in something harder to replace. Energy. Ease. The particular freedom of not having to manage yourself constantly. It was loneliness of a very specific type, not the loneliness of having no one around, but the loneliness of being not quite fully present with anyone, including yourself. And that, in the end, is what this story is about. Not a dramatic secret. Not a scandalous reveal. The title will make more sense later, and I promise you it is far gentler than it sounds. What this is, at its core, is a story about a person who spent a very long time carrying a small, quiet thing in private, a way of being that felt like themselves, and who eventually slowly learned to set it down somewhere safe rather than hide it. It begins with a scarf. It ends somewhere much warmer. The 20s are a particular kind of exhausting that nobody warns you about adequately. Everyone tells you about the freedoms, the independence, the firsts, the feeling of authorship over your own life. What they mention less, or mention in tones you can't quite decode until you're inside it, is the weight of that authorship. When you are responsible for constructing yourself from scratch, with limited materials and no clear blueprint, and when the world is watching and evaluating the construction in real time, the process is quietly grueling in a way that can be hard to name while you're living it. I was 24 when I first understood that I was managing myself more than I was living. My work at the time was in a field that rewarded a specific kind of presentation, competent, direct, slightly compressed emotionally, always legible to others in a way that required keeping most of your actual interior at arm's length. I was good at it. I got better at it every year. And every year I also noticed that it cost me something I couldn't quite identify, something I kept going home at the end of the day feeling mildly depleted of. I had an apartment by myself for the first time in my life I had truly private space, which is a thing that sounds mundane until you haven't had it and then suddenly do. And in that private space, something that had been dormant since childhood began to stir again. Not urgently, not as a crisis. More like a plant that had been kept in a very dark corner, finally getting a small amount of indirect light. I started, very tentatively, to explore things. I want to describe this carefully because I think the way these things tend to get described in media does a disservice to how quiet and ordinary and personal they usually are. There was no dramatic midnight transformation. There was no costume. What there was, initially, was permission, a tiny, fragile, experimental grant of permission to be curious about what I actually found comforting rather than what I was supposed to find comforting. This started with very small things. Skincare, of all uncinematic beginnings. A friend had mentioned a particular moisturizer, casually, in the context of nothing important, and I had gone home and looked it up and purchased it and used it and noticed, with a surprise that embarrassed me, that the ritual of it settled something in me. The deliberateness of it. The care. The fact that I was doing something for myself that had no audience and required no performance. It sounds almost too small to matter. But that is exactly the point. The meaningful things, in my experience, rarely announce themselves at appropriate volumes. From skincare came other small rituals. Better attention to my own comfort, not in a self-indulgent way, but in the way of someone learning for the first time that their own comfort is worth attending to. I became interested in texture in a way I hadn't let myself be before. Softer fabrics at home, warmer colors, small, private aesthetic choices that aligned more honestly with something in me that I was only beginning to acknowledge. There was still shame, I should be honest about that. Not the volcanic, acute shame of having done something wrong, more like the background anxiety of doing something unsanctioned. The feeling that what I was doing didn't fit the category I had been assigned to, and that this mismatch, if discovered, would require a kind of explanation I wasn't sure I was prepared to give. So I was careful. Not secretive exactly, but private, in the way that many people are private about the parts of themselves they haven't yet found language for. My apartment was my space. What happened in it was mine. I remember one evening in particular. It had been a long week, the kind that accumulates rather than peaks. Nothing terrible, just a sustained low-grade friction with everything. Work had been demanding in the particular way it demanded when it didn't respect the line between you and it. I had been performing competence and certainty all week in contexts where I felt neither. I came home on a Friday evening and sat on my floor for a while doing nothing, which is its own kind of data about the state I was in. Eventually I got up. I made tea. I did the small rituals I had begun to build, the careful, quiet, attentive self-care that had become, without my quite planning it, a kind of anchor. And at some point I found myself in front of my mirror, wearing softer clothes than I would wear in public, with my hair slightly different, with a very minimal application of something subtle that changed the light of my face slightly, and I looked at the person in the mirror and felt, for the first time in days, that I was looking at someone I recognized. Not a stranger. not a costume. Me, in a register that was quieter and softer and more honest than the one I wore to work. I stood there for a while. The city made its city sounds outside. Nobody was watching. That was, I think now, the night something changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way a dial turns. Something that had been hidden became, in that apartment, in that quiet, simply mine. I didn't know what to call it. I still wasn't sure I needed to. What I knew was that I was tired of being tired in the specific way that comes from carrying yourself at a distance from yourself. And I had found something small, private, personal, unspectacular, that let me set that distance down. For now, that was enough. The thing about understanding yourself is that it rarely arrives in full sentences. It comes instead in fragments. A feeling here, a recognition there. A moment of unexpectedly seeing yourself in something you weren't looking at and finding the reflection more accurate than the one you've been presenting. The language comes last, always, after the experience, after the practice, often long after you've already been doing the thing you're still not sure you have words for. By my late 20s, the private self I had been quietly building had become something I thought about with less anxiety and more simple familiarity. Not without complexity, I want to be clear about that. There were still moments of internal negotiation, still the occasional uncomfortable question about what any of this meant or where it fit or what a person was supposed to do with it. But the baseline had shifted. The shame, which had always been more reflexive than reasoned, had begun to thin. I had also, by this point, made the tentative and significant step of reading about other people's experiences. This matters more than it might sound. For a very long time, the version of this experience I had access to was the version reflected by a culture that didn't take it seriously, either comic or transgressive, or reduced to something dramatic and sensational. None of those mirrors fit. What I found, when I finally looked in the right places, was something far more varied, far more ordinary, far more human than any of those framings suggested. People who had felt exactly the particular strain of something not quite fitting. People who had found, in precisely these private spaces and quiet rituals, exactly this kind of ease. People for whom the word that eventually arrived was not a crisis, but simply a description. I learned the word crossdressing in the way you sometimes learn the word for something you've been doing all along, with a complicated mixture of recognition and resistance. Recognition because yes, obviously, that was the shape of it. Resistance because words carry freight, and this word carried freight I wasn't sure I wanted, associations I hadn't signed up for. But language, even imperfect language, does something important. It removes the thing from the category of unnameable. And once something has a name, even a provisional, complicated name, it becomes slightly less frightening. It becomes something you can think about rather than something that simply happens to you. I also, around this time, told someone, this is the part that I have thought about most in the years since, because it felt enormous at the time and became, in the telling, something much smaller and more manageable. A close friend, someone I had known since before most of the life I've described here, and I were talking late one evening in the particular way that old friends talk when the hour has gotten past social niceties and into something realer. I don't remember exactly how the topic arrived, but I remember the moment I decided, with a distinct internal lurch, to say the thing rather than redirect around it. I told her that I had been exploring something privately, that there was a version of how I dressed and presented in my own space that felt more comfortable to me than the version I showed the world, that I wasn't entirely sure what it meant or where it fit, but that it was real and it was mine, and I had carried it alone for a long time. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, "Okay, tell me what it's like." Not how long has this been happening or what does this mean about you or any of the questions I had been dreading. Just tell me what it's like. Which is, I now understand, exactly the right question to ask someone who has just trusted you with something they've been carrying privately for years. You ask what it feels like from the inside. I told her, haltingly, imprecisely, with many corrections and qualifications, but I told her. And she listened. And, at the end she said something I have thought about many times since. It sounds like you found something that makes you feel more like yourself. That seems like a good thing. It was not a profound statement. It was the kind of thing that looks nearly unremarkable when written down. But it landed in me with the weight of something that had been in the air for a very long time finally touching the ground. That conversation did not resolve everything. Understanding is not a single event. What it did was confirm something I had been tentatively constructing, that this part of me was not a problem to be solved, not a secret to be managed, but simply an aspect of myself to be known. By me first and most importantly, and gradually by a small number of people who deserved to know me. I started, in the months that followed, to be slightly less careful. Not careless. I am not describing a sudden shedding of privacy or a public declaration. More like, I stopped treating this part of myself as though it were inherently dangerous. I stopped checking over my shoulder in my own home. I began to spend time in that softer, quieter version of myself, not as a furtive comfort, but as something closer to ordinary self-expression. And the extraordinary thing was how ordinary it felt. Not the dramatic relief of a secret finally released, more the quiet normalization of something that was always just a part of life, something that had only felt enormous because it had been kept compressed. The language arrived slowly. The peace arrived even more slowly. But both arrived. I've spent a long time deciding whether to include this part of the story. Not because it is shameful. It isn't, and I've worked too hard to let it become that again. But because it is the part that is easiest to misread, the part most likely to be taken out of context, the part that most resists the careful, unglamorous honesty I've tried to maintain throughout. But it happened, and it changed something important, and leaving it out would be dishonest. I was 31. I had been in a relationship for about 2 years, a good one, genuinely good, built on the kind of comfort and attentiveness that comes when two people actually pay attention to each other. Her name was Maya. She was smart and perceptive and had a way of seeing through things I didn't realize I was doing, which was occasionally uncomfortable and almost always valuable. I had not told her about this part of me. I want to sit with that for a moment rather than rush past it, because the decision not to tell her was not simple or cowardly. It was, I thought at the time, a considered one. We had been together long enough that I knew this was something I should address, but not quite long enough, or so I rationalized, to find the right moment. What this actually meant was that the right moment kept not being quite right, and the conversation kept not happening, and the private rituals I had come to rely on for equilibrium were happening in the margins of a shared life. I had gotten careless. Not dramatically careless. I wasn't leaving things out or abandoning the careful compartmentalization I'd maintained. I had simply, incrementally, stopped being quite as vigilant. Because the more ordinary this had become to me internally, the more effort it took to treat it as something requiring active concealment. I was tired of the concealment. I had been tired of it for years. One Sunday afternoon, this is the part that the title announces, and that I approach now with the same slightly absurd awareness with which one recounts any story about being seen before you were ready. Maya came home earlier than I expected. I was in the kitchen. I had spent a quiet morning in exactly the way I'd learned to use these quiet mornings, the soft rituals, the comfortable clothing, the low-key version of myself that felt most like rest. The sound of the key in the door registered half a second before the door opened, which is exactly enough time to know what's happening and not enough time to change it. She saw me. I want to describe the moment with the honesty it deserves, which means resisting the dramatic version. There was no gasp. There was no long cinematic silence. She looked at me. I looked at her. The door was still partly open behind her. Neither of us moved for what felt like a very long time, but was probably 7 seconds. Then she said, "Oh. Then, I didn't know you were home." Then, after another pause, she came the rest of the way in and put her bag down. I did not try to explain immediately, which was, I think, the right instinct. There is a version of this moment in which I would have rushed to manage her reaction before she'd even had one, filling the silence with reassurances and context and preemptive apologies. I didn't do that. I let the moment be what it was. I stood in my kitchen, in the truth of who I was at that moment, and I waited. She sat down at the kitchen table. She looked at me again, not with judgment, I could see that, but with the careful attention of someone processing something unfamiliar. Then she said, "Can you talk to me about this?" And I sat down across from her, and I did. This conversation was harder than the one with my friend years before. Longer. More complicated. There were tears at some point, though I could now tell you exactly when or from which of us they came first. There are questions that didn't have clean answers. There were long pauses where neither of us spoke and the silence held weight. But there was also something else, something I had not permitted myself to expect. There was Maya looking at me across a kitchen table with the same quality of attention she had always given me, and listening, and asking questions that were motivated by genuine curiosity rather than by alarm. There was her saying at one point, "I'm not upset. I think I'm just trying to understand where this fits." And then later, something I will never forget. She said, "Does it make you happy? This?" And I thought about it honestly, which she deserved, and I said yes, not happy in an uncomplicated way, because nothing is, but yes, this was something that had given me peace when peace was difficult to find, and yes, it felt like a real part of myself, and yes, it had taken me a very long time to be able to say that to anyone. She nodded slowly. "Then I want to know about it," she said. "I want to know you." The things that follow from that conversation are their own long story, one that belongs to both of us, and that I keep private out of respect for her as much as anything else. What I will say is that being truly known by someone, not in spite of something you've carried in private but including it with curiosity and care, is a different experience than I had words for. Something that had felt like a limitation became, in her understanding, simply a part of the person she was in a relationship with. That shift required time and honesty from both of us. It required conversations and questions, and the occasional discomfort of navigating something neither of us had a roadmap for. But it was also, in a very real sense, the end of the most isolating part of this story. From that afternoon in the kitchen, I was no longer carrying something alone. That matters more than I know how to say. I am older now than I was in all those other parts. This is the part of the story that doesn't have a climax, which I have come to understand is the truest thing about it. The most meaningful transformations in a person's life rarely resolve into a single clear ending. They continue instead into something that looks from the outside like ordinary life and feels from the inside like a kind of earned quiet. I think about the person I was at 10, holding a silk scarf in a bedroom not my own, feeling for a few seconds the relief of something unguarded. I think about the person at 24 sitting on an apartment floor at the end of a long week, learning slowly and tentatively that some forms of self-care are not indulgences, but necessities. I think about the kitchen and Maya, and the moment of being seen before I was ready, which became, in the end, the beginning of being seen at all. I am not going to tell you that everything resolved neatly. Life, in my experience, does not do that, and any story that ends in perfect clarity is probably editing out the parts where clarity slipped away again for a while and had to be found a second time. What I have instead is something I think is better than resolution. I have familiarity. I know this part of myself. I have known it long enough that it no longer surprises me, no longer requires justification, no longer carries the specific exhaustion of something that has to be managed rather than simply lived. The crossdressing. I use the word now without the weight it used to carry, the way you eventually use any word that has stopped needing to hurt you, is, in my adult life, exactly what it always was in private, a personal aesthetic practice, a form of self-expression, a set of rituals that allow me access to a softer, quieter version of myself that I have come to think of simply as me. Not a costume version. Not a hidden version. A version. Maya and I are still together. What grew between us after that Sunday afternoon is something I am grateful for in a way that is difficult to articulate without sounding like I'm describing something more dramatic than it was. She did not change who she was to accommodate this. I did not become someone different. What happened instead was a gradual deepening of knowledge, her knowledge of me, my willingness to be known, that I think made us both better at being in a relationship than we had been before. There are people in my life now who know this about me. Not everyone. Privacy remains a value, and the decision about who to let in is always mine to make. But the number of people who know me fully, rather than the edited version of me, has grown. And each time someone has known and remained, has known and asked good questions, has known and simply incorporated it into their understanding of who I am, something in me has knelt slightly in gratitude. I want to say something about the concept of coping because I used that word in my own head for a long time, and I've had to revise my understanding of it. For years I thought of the private rituals I built, The self-care, the softness, the quiet time being a version of myself that felt most like rest, as coping mechanisms. As if they were a response to something difficult, a technique for managing emotional strain. And they were that, in part. But coping implies something temporary, something reactive, something you do until the crisis passes. What I have come to understand is that these things were never just coping. They were living. They were me figuring out in the only private laboratory available to me who I actually was and what I actually needed. The loneliness I described in the early sections of the story was real. The exhaustion of performing a self that didn't quite fit was real. But the solution was never to find a way to perform it better or to stop feeling the mismatch. The solution, arrived at slowly, imperfectly, over many years, was to close the gap. To bring the private self and the public self into closer alignment. Not all the way, not in every context, because we are all various selves in various rooms, and that's fine. But close enough that the cost of being myself was no longer the dominant fact of my interior life. I don't want to oversell this. I am still a person with ordinary anxieties and ordinary difficulties and ordinary weeks where the friction of being alive accumulates in ways that don't resolve neatly. The self-knowledge I've described doesn't insulate you from those things. What it does, what I have found it does, is give you something solid to return to. A sense of your own actual shape. The knowledge that when you step away from the noise, you know who will be there. There is, I've learned, a particular kind of peace available to people who have done the work of knowing themselves, not the peace of having solved everything, but the peace of being less a stranger to yourself than you used to be. That peace is quieter than happiness and more durable than contentment. It is, I think, what people mean when they talk about coming home to yourself. I live there now, mostly, with lapses and returns, with the ordinary difficulty of a life being lived, with the people I love and the private rituals that are no longer anything to hide. And sometimes, on a quiet evening, in my own space, in the soft light of a room that is entirely mine, I think of a 10-year-old holding a silk scarf and feeling, for a few wordless seconds, the relief of something unguarded. And I want to tell that child. It takes a while, but you get there. The person you are in the quiet is not something you have to hide forever. They are just you, waiting to be met. You will meet them.